Greetings, viewers. So this is a brief overview of the 13th and final chapter of my text, Third Supercycle. The chapter covers the events of the period 1944 to 1945, and I call this period the Allied War of Liberation because it's more than just fighting the war, it's the mechanisms and structures and decisions which set the world of 1945 in motion. So the construction of sort of permanent structures and permanent institutions that would then have another history after the war in terms of the Cold War and new colonial competition and so forth. The basic point of the chapter is this. Whereas World War I, in the course of fighting that war, 4 of the land empires implode, and their implosion triggers a massive cycle of uprisings, anti-colonial and anti-imperial uprisings and revolutions between 1916 and 1922. World War II, on the other hand, the insurrection against the empires isn't something that was accidentally created. In fact, the mission of destroying colonial empires becomes a core mission of the Allied War of Liberation. So the war turns from a war of empires or of neo-colonial imperialisms. By 1944, it's taken on some of the characteristics of an anti-colonial war of liberation. This is particularly true in Yugoslavia, in China, Eastern Front, but also arguably in terms of defeating Axis Germany and its occupation of democratic states in Europe. So the chapter divides this huge topic up into sort of 4 general areas. And the way I think about it is that there were 4 outcomes to the War of Liberation. 3 of them were actually policy objectives that the Allied war planners had agreed upon, carried out, and successfully implemented. The 4th was not a policy objective. The 4th was what ordinary people all across the world decided to do in response to the War of Liberation. And they did a number of interesting things, which I'll get to at the end of this talk. So just to focus on the 3 policy objectives which were achieved, and these were, I'll run down them very quickly. Number 1, the occupation of the 3 Axis polities and the abolition of their colonial empires. Now, this was achieved, a very violent and bloody process, and one of the things that had to happen there was not just the defeat of their armies and the occupation of their territories, it was also the disintegration and dissolution of their colonial empires. And this involved the massive relocation of settler colonial populations back to a home country. The historians estimate probably 14.6 million ethnic Germans were relocated from areas all in Eastern Europe and Western Asia back to East and West Germany after 1945. 3.2 million Japanese colonists were relocated from Eastern and Southeastern Asia, where they're part of the Japanese Empire's settler colonial project of colonizing Asia, and they were returned to Japan. And a much smaller number of Italian colonists in Libya and Ethiopia were returned to Italy. So that was carried out, and Germany was divided, Japan was occupied, Italy becomes a democracy, Austria it's occupied, becomes a democracy. Second major policy objective, which is achieved, the United States becomes the new world hegemon and invents a raft of policies to achieve this. So the US dollar becomes the world reserve currency, the Bretton Woods system of managed exchange rates comes into existence at the behest of the US Treasury. The United States makes up about half of the world economic output in 1945. So its economy is dominant, and it sets the rules for the next 63 years of human history. Will rule the world system for 63 years after 1945, all the way to 2008. The third policy objective, which was achieved, was temporarily transforming the Soviet Empire into the world's 3rd most powerful empire. So behind the United States, behind Britain, but definitely the number 3 in the world in 1945. And this is a temporary condition because France would be reconstituted and it would become a major power. West Germany would recover after the war. Japan would become a major economy after the war. And the position of the Soviet Empire would slide quite rapidly after 1950 and slide down and slide down. As a little side note, one of the interesting reasons that Soviet elites failed to notice the diminution of their geopolitical influence was that during this period when their influence was sliding, the influence of the of the colonial empires was also disappearing. So this is a period in history when the British Empire is coming apart, the French Empire is coming apart, and eventually the Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, Belgian empires are all going to disappear. So it seems like the world is shrinking. It seems like these large entities that existed for hundreds of years are disappearing. So from the Soviet perspective, it seems like they're just getting stronger because their competitors are disappearing. In reality, the Soviet Empire was not competitive. It would have severe problems against modern industrial economies and remain pretty much trapped in the semi-periphery for the duration of its history, and would not be able to escape the lockdown of the semi-periphery. Now, the chapter spends most of its time on the fourth outcome, the outcome that the Allied planners did not anticipate, but in some ways is actually the most important of all. And this outcome was what ordinary people, how they responded to this war of liberation, and what new institutions and new struggles emerged in response to that. I term this outcome the rise of the transnational commons. Now, this commons was not the commons of today, where today the commons is enormous. It's the internet, it's video game culture, it's a global civil rights culture, it's a global media culture. It's incredibly powerful and capable of mobilizing people. This was the beginning of this transnational commons. So its institutions were very, very, very scattershot, fragmented, incomplete, inchoate, occasionally contradictory. And so everything starts to be set in motion during this period. This commons did have a number of achievements to its credit. Two of the most obvious are after 1945, the transnational commons plays a key role in demobilization. Now, this is one of the great success stories following the war, because you have this terrible period, 31 years of planetary violence, and then finally you have a cessation of the conflict. And you had the potential for continued mayhem, for a cycle of violence to continue. What would happen instead was everyone agreed that the fighting needed to stop, at least in the main combatant areas. And roughly 30 million soldiers on the Allied and Axis side would return to civilian life over approximately 4 years. So an extraordinary success story. They'd be fundamentally changed by that experience, but the demobilization would happen, and economies would go back. They'd shift from a war economy back to a civilian economy. The other side of this was that it wasn't just the demobilization, it was also an upsurge of democratization. So the refounding of democracies, the establishment of post-colonial societies, or post-colonial nation states, or political polities of various kinds. There were a number of these, the return of democracy in Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Italy, Japan, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, and West Germany. It's important to read them all out to realize how the democratic institutions in those societies are quite new. They're reestablished or established for the first time in many ways in 1945. And when they're reestablished, of course, they're reestablished with a number of important changes. One of the most important of these changes is that female suffrage becomes pretty much universal after 1945. This was not true after 1918. There was a wave of democratization after 1918 and a limited transformation, but there's a much bigger wave of democratization after 1945. The other side of this story is there are a number of new polities that emerge from former empires, particularly the Axis empires. So Albania, Iceland gets its independence from Denmark, North Korea, South Korea, Vietnam, not yet the two Vietnams, happened later in 1954, and Yugoslavia. Now, Vietnam, of course, would remain occupied by French colonialism for some time, but the guerrilla war would begin, and Ho Chi Minh would organize the Viet Minh, and a national resistance movement begins. Yugoslavia Titoist state does take power and will administer the society after 1945. The last thing to mention about the chapter is transnational commons also generates three new movements, which were very, very small, localized, and relatively insignificant in the immediate post-war period, but which become enormously important and system decisive in the decades to come. And certainly in our own day, they become these powerhouse sort of zones or entities that are tremendously influential. So really fields of struggle, not just a single movement, but a whole host of movements, transformations, and struggles, which are enormously influential. So these three are, number one, transnational anti-colonial struggles. So these are still going strong today. They would sweep the field after 1945. The world of the empires would come to an end and new polities would be created. Many of these polities would have many of the same problems as their colonial predecessors. Of course, they would replace colonial despotisms with neo-colonial despotisms. However, this was still a step in the right direction. So at least there was a greater degree of there's some degree of political participation which had not existed in the colonial era. The second was transnational civil rights. So a lot of the histories of this period focus on the American side of the story, and certainly the African American civil rights revolution. It begins actually in the U.S. military. So GIs, African American GIs, drafted into the military, and they get unfair treatment. They're discriminated against due to Jim Crow and racism, and they protest. And what's different about the 1920s and 30s is that in the 1940s, the press listens and the people of America are ready to listen because they're fighting a war against fascism, so shouldn't we be against domestic fascism? The answer is yes. So the protests take effect and they trigger policy changes, and the whole civil rights revolution really starts with African American soldiers fighting for rights and finding an audience for that, and people beginning to mobilize around those and beginning to win battles. Desegregation in the U.S. military wouldn't officially happen until 1947, but many of the early battles take place in 1941, 42, 43. But 1944, 45 was a critical turning point where it really becomes official policy, and senior members in the defense establishment and the administration agree that this needs to happen. The last place, transnational feminism takes off, and this was also partly due to the war. We had all these young men who were drafted to serve as soldiers, so women stepped up and were working. But it was also a more general transformation. Women were winning suffrage in the post-war polities and societies, and there was a massive transformation of gender roles that occurs. This was also true, by the way, of many of the anti-colonial struggles. So Yugoslavia is an interesting case where there is this mobilization of gender with problems, and it's limited, but it does take place under the Titoist party state because it is mobilizing against fascism. And so, yes, aren't women oppressed by these traditional forms of marriage and patriarchy? Yes, they are. So they start to mobilize, and there are changes that happen, and concrete conditions do change. So this is the broad brush of things. The very last thing I would want to mention, one of the most interesting long-term legacies of this period is actually the culture created during this period of 1944-1945. And this isn't really locatable to any one of these spaces, so it has one foot in the anti-colonial, it has one foot in the civil rights revolution, it has one foot in the feminist struggles, and it partakes of all of those things, and yet it's not reducible to those things. So a kind of a cultural commons starts to emerge. It's no accident that the foundation for 21st century culture, which is computing technology, the world's first electronic computers created 1945, ENIAC. But I have something more specific in mind. The sense of a cultural commons of not just of high technologies being created, that is part of the story, but also of new forms of cultural solidarity are created during this period. Now, these forms are very brittle. They're very inchoate. They're not quite a flash in the pan. They're more like certain things are created during this time period which were not possible after 1945. But this little sort of hothouse environment of 1945, 44, 45, they're created, they flourish, they become temporarily popular, and they leave a legacy that we can read decades and centuries later and understand that, oh, yes, this is a little marker that things were headed in that direction. This is a little promissory note on the future. One of the most interesting of these promissory notes was the field of popular music. So American popular music becomes the world's popular music after 1945. This is part of the U.S. hegemonic project, but it's also because of the sheer productivity of the African American population in the United States. It's subject to horrendous racism and violence, and it responds by creating this amazing poetry, novels, art forms, lyric, plays, and musical and song forms of all kinds. And one of the great examples here of the solidarity, which is multiracial by definition, multi-gender, multi-everything, is gospel music. One of the great gospel tunes from this time is sort of the unofficial anthem of the Popular Front. It's a song called "We're in the Same Boat, Brother." And it's a famous tune. It was originally written by E.Y. Harburg, also known as Yip Harburg, and the music was composed by Earl Robinson, two very prominent figures, popular writers and lyricists and songwriters and musicians of this time period. And it was sung by Leadbelly, the great African-American blues artist. And we only have a couple great recordings of these, but the recordings are just magical and marvelous because it's a gospel tune, but Leadbelly transforms it into this, what's almost like the ancestor of hip-hop music to a large extent. It's doing something, it's sampling gospel music to create something transnational, has a transnational logic to it. The final stanza of the song, you can find the song on YouTube, but I want to read to you the final stanza because it sort of epitomizes how so many things have changed since 1945, and yet those legacies are still alive and with us today in some very profound ways. So I'll quote from Harburg's lyrics here. Quote, "When the boilers blew up somewhere in Spain, the keel was smashed in far Ukraine, and the steam poured out from Oregon to Maine. Oh, it took some time for the crew to learn what is bad for the bow ain't good for the stern. If a hatch takes fire in China Bay, Pearl Harbor's deck's gonna blaze away." Unquote. So this is at the height of the Pacific War, and it's a deeply anti-war lyric. It's basically a warning that if you don't deal with the social problems of societies, when boilers explode and keels smash and steam escapes and mayhem happens, if you don't deal with the contradictions, they explode and create tremendous violence. What's bad for the bow ain't good for the stern. You know, what's bad for the people up top, who are at the top of the society, is not good for the people in we're one interconnected ship. That's the key insight here. And it's fascinating to see that idea become a leitmotif of almost all the progressive works. You think of the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, into our day, this notion of the Earth as this giant ship in outer space. That's sort of the limit point of our notion of solidarity, that we're all connected. The notion that 8 billion people on this planet have something in common, the potential of a democracy which would nourish human beings instead of preying on them, the democracy of the 8 billion. Well, that seedbed is there in this song. If a hatch takes fire in China Bay, Pearl Harbor's deck's gonna blaze away. And I especially appreciate the fact that the writers of the song refer to two of the unknown struggles of World War II. Okay, reference to Spain, the Spanish Civil War, and the terrible tragedy of Franco's victory in that war, but also the keel was smashed in far Ukraine, actually referring to something happening in a polity that wasn't even recognized as a country back then. So they didn't refer to the Soviet Empire, they referred to Ukraine. I don't know how that magic happened. You'd have to ask Yip Harburg, where he heard of the term, and did he have relatives there, which is entirely possible, or he knew people who were refugees from that part of the world. That's also possible. But whatever the case is, this reference to these struggles elsewhere on the planet and these tragedies, but they're also connected to us because we're actually on one ship, which means we actually have to take care of it and take care of each other and be better than our past.